So as I say, these two books, they're very readable. There's a problem with them, though, in that although I'm referring primarily here to the first one, The Black-Eyed Children, although it contains a lot of first-hand testimony, there's a high degree of anonymization. In other words, the people, the witnesses in the main are referred to by their first names only. And it's not clear to me in most of the cases whether the reports that Weatherly has obtained from these informants have in any way been corroborated. By its nature, the black-eyed children phenomenon is one that tends to involve solitary witnesses. So very kind of direct corroboration is inherently difficult. Obviously, if there's only one person who sees an entity on a given occasion. But if you imagine that you receive a report from someone who claims that they've had an experience of this type and they were disturbed by it, it might be possible, if you contact friends or associates, to actually find out whether indeed they mentioned the reported experience around the time, and whether the people spoken to had the impression that the informant was genuinely upset or disturbed by the experience, because these experiences do tend to be disturbing. So this is a problem with Weatherly's book, but it's very readable. Now, Weatherly sort of depicts typical characteristics of black-eyed kids. I'm using the acronym BEC for brevity, of a typical BEC encounter. Maybe not all sources would depict the events in the same way, but from Weatherly's collection, there is certainly a commonality about many of the stories. And as I said, usually there's only one witness. A typical experience might be someone in the evening, maybe around sunset, alone in the house. There's a knocking on their door, not a ringing of the bell, strangely. The person may wonder why the caller, whoever it is, hasn't rung the bell. Go to the door, they open the door, and they see two children, maybe aged 12 to 14, something of that age. Could be boys, could be a boy and a girl. One of the children acts as the spokesman or spokesperson and addresses the householder and says, "We'd like to come in, maybe to watch some television or make a use of the phone." An odd request, and perhaps from the outset, even before the witness notices anything particularly unusual about the child or the children, he or she experiences a feeling of distinct apprehension and unease, and maybe feels in some sense phased, not in quite the right state of mind, in an indecisive, troubled frame of mind. The request from the spokesman is repeated, initially politely, but then when the householder doesn't acquiesce in the request, the tone becomes more importunate. The child might say something like, "Look, mister, we're just a couple of kids, we'd like to come in." And the implication of the question, or it may be said very explicitly, is that the visitors need to be asked in. They can't just walk in. In this sense, black-eyed children are different from entities such as alien greys and ghosts, which can just turn up in people's houses or homes. These things, according to Weatherly, they seem to require to be asked in. Anyway, the householder is feeling perplexed by all this, and eventually the children look up, or the householder notices that they've got coal black eyes. Now, this takes two forms with regard to so-called black-eyed children. In some cases, the person reports that the children have black eyes, reflective black eyes. They may sort of reflect light, but the eyes themselves are solid black. The other version is where the person is looking at someone and the person doesn't seem to have eyes, but there are black holes or sockets where the eyes should be. Strictly speaking, in referring to the latter, I suppose one shouldn't call them black-eyed children if they don't have eyes, but I'll use that term broadly to describe both categories. And indeed, it may be very difficult for a witness, particularly if they're stressed, to actually make that distinction, particularly if the child is some distance away from them. So upon seeing the black eyes, the householder, the witness, will be totally freaked out and disturbed, and feeling shocked, the witness will most likely close the door and lock it probably, and retreat into the house or apartment in a state of shock and concern. There may be continued knocking on the door for a while, and then eventually it goes away. But the witness isn't free of anxiety and stress, because they may have a sleepless or disturbed night. They may be worried about seeing these sinister looking kids again. And they may get flashbacks. In other words, they may get experience features of what we could call post-traumatic stress disorder. So these experiences are generally unpleasant. Well, almost universally, if not universally unpleasant. Now, CJ said at the beginning that he thought that these reports went back a decade or so. Some people say that they came into circulation in the mid-1990s, and the first experience, or the first report, was by a journalist called Brian Bethel. Now, this case is discussed by Bethel. You can also find an interview on the internet. You can hear Bethel talking about the experience. And that's largely what I've based what I'm saying about Bethel on. The gist of the experience was, this was in about 1996. In this interview I'm referring to, Bethel actually, I think, mentions the year 1996, but I also saw a written account by him where he equivocated slightly. He said that he hadn't actually written down this experience immediately, or the date of it, but he thought it was 1996. He was in his car in his hometown of Abilene in Texas, and he was writing out a check to pay an internet bill, and he was going to drop the check into a drop box. Where he was parked was near what he called a theatre marquee, which seemed to house a cinema. There was a knocking on the driver's side window of the car, and he saw two boys. He wound down the window a little bit, and one of the boys, acting as the spokesman, asked him to give them a ride. The child claimed that they'd come out to see a film. They'd forgotten their money, left their money behind, and could Bethel take them home so they could get their money, come back and watch the film. Now, this was about approximately 10 to 10. On seeing the children, Bethel immediately felt uncomfortable, very, very uncomfortable. This is before he noticed anything about their eyes. And one part of him perhaps thought, well, they're just kids asking this, and that's not too terribly unreasonable. But he felt uneasy, and the request was repeated. And eventually, as I say, the spokesman became more importunate and said, look, mister, we're just a couple of kids. We just want to, get the money and see the film. Bethel asked them what film it was they wanted to see, and it was Mortal Kombat. But the problem was that the last showing of the film was about 9:30, or was 9:30. And therefore, if Bethel had taken these children back to the house, if they had a house, that is, and then returned them to the area, a lot of the film, a big chunk of it, would have passed by then. So the request didn't make sense. But around this time, Bethel noticed their coal black eyes, and that just magnified greatly the existing apprehension he had. And he mumbled a couple of excuses and wound up his window. preparatory to sort of driving off. One of the kids then slammed on the window repeatedly and said something to the effect that we need you to ask us in before we can come in. But Bethel wasn't minded to hang around. He reversed out of the parking spot and hurriedly drove away. And looking in his rear view mirror, he couldn't see any children, couldn't see the children at all. After this event, he was anxious and troubled, and he went on to experience some seemingly paranormal phenomena when he eventually got round to discussing it in public. Equipment would go wrong, something like that. He also mentioned in the interview I'd referred to a run of bad luck. He didn't go into details about the nature of that bad luck, but I'm not sure whether the bad luck was an immediate consequence of this encounter with the black-eyed children, or whether it occurred after he'd gone public about the matter. That's a little bit of uncertainty about that. But as you'll see, there are further reports of witnesses to black-eyed children experiencing bad luck. I think, as far as I can gather from Weatherly's book, this isn't the typical case. And to the extent that these cases of bad luck following an encounter are selectively reported, they could give an impression that there's a sort of causal relation between the Beck encounter and the bad luck. And it could perhaps just be a coincidence. Because it's not maybe the typical pattern, we have to bear that in mind. But these cases, which I'll turn to, are of interest. Now, a question might be asked, what would happen if you did invite one of these entities or creatures or people in when they made a request? As I say, the reaction of witnesses is typically one of apprehension, and I gather that it's most mainly they don't invite them in. But there is a case that that Weatherly reports, which, if true, is disturbing. And it involved a woman who he called Sharon, I think it is, and she was a nurse in Iowa, and she'd come off a shift, and she collected her son, who'd been, I think, staying with his grandmother overnight, collected the son and was heading home with him, and she decided to pop into a convenience store to get some milk and cereal. She was only going to be a moment, so she left her son in the car, sitting in the back seat, while she popped into the convenience store. When she came back out, she started the car and looked into the rear view mirror and was horrified to see a boy sitting very close to her son, and the boy had black eyes. Trying to contain her panic, she leapt out of the car, opened the back door and yanked her son out and dragged him with her as she retreated to the convenience store, where she told the sales assistant that there was someone in her car. After ascertaining that the person in the car didn't have a gun, the sales assistant went out into the parking area, which was empty, looked into the car. There was no sign of an intruder. The man reached into the car, switched off the engine, and closed the doors. He then went and looked around the sides and back of the building, and there was no sign of anyone. Sharon didn't go into this matter with him. She didn't sort of go into any detail. In fact, I think she was finding it hard to even describe the situation. She was so upset. The man, the sales assistant, was minded to phone the police, but Sharon didn't want that. I think she feared that they would regard her as a sort of nutcase or something of that kind. However, although she wanted to get her son back home quickly, she just couldn't bring herself to do so in the car, where she'd just had the fright. So she phoned her husband, Tom, who arrived at the convenience store quite quickly in his truck. After a bit of conversation, Sharon and the boy, her son, went home in Tom's truck. And Tom had a conversation with the sales assistant and looked around the car park himself, and then got into the car, started it up, and then noticed an unpleasant smell like that of soiled nappies. And this sort of unpleasant smell came at him in waves and seemed to get worse as it continued. He drove off, but within a few miles, he crashed his car, wrapped it around a post of some kind. Couldn't remember the accident itself. He was a driver spotted the wreckage and phoned for help, and Tom was taken to a hospital. Had a headache, which cleared up by the evening, but he was kept in the hospital overnight for observation. Shortly after Tom's discharge from the hospital, this was the day after the Beck encounter, the child, became ill with various symptoms and signs, skin rashes. I think there was vomiting. I can't remember the details, but this went on for weeks, and doctors allegedly were unable to identify any particular illness. I mean, the child was obviously suffering from various symptoms and signs, but a definitive diagnosis wasn't made. But the parents prayed for their child and asked family members to do the same. And after some weeks, he did recover. So the question here, of course, is: were these two events, the car accident and the child's illness, directly attributable to the Beck encounter? There are three possibilities really here. One is that it was coincidence. These were coincidences. The second one, perhaps, was that the Beck encounter was somehow an omen of things to come. Or the third possibility was a sort of curse, if you like, that the Beck encounter somehow precipitated these following events. I think the curse explanation is more credible than an omen, because when you think about this particular incident, Tom would not have been driving his wife's car at the point when he had the accident if it had not been for the Beck encounter, because, as I've said, Sharon phoned him. She couldn't bring herself to use the car herself at that point. And therefore, it was in a sense because of the Beck encounter that Tom was in the situation he was in. So you could see a causal relation there, although that doesn't mean that there was a malevolent causal relationship there, but it's a possibility. This is another one of these sort of bad luck stories. A woman, I think this woman was, sorry, I think I'm just going to go back. Yeah. This woman, I think she's called Beth in Weatherly's book. She had a Beck encounter. She wasn't very willing to go into too much detail about it. I think maybe because she found it traumatic. As in other cases, the children wanted to be invited in, and she declined. And one of the Becks, if I've got this right, a girl actually took hold of the witness's wrist. The witness broke free and retreated into her apartment and closed the door on them. She had a sleepless night, and the next day she became ill with a stomach virus. The following day, her car was broken into and her laptop was stolen from it. The day after that, she lost her job and she was ditched by her boyfriend of 7 years. So she had quite a spate of bad luck. Within just days of that, the breakup of that relationship, she went to see a psychic. I think it was her mother who had sort of directed her towards this psychic, saying that this one was good. about 12 minutes into the meeting with the psychic, and Beth hadn't mentioned anything about the Beck encounter. The woman said that you've had an encounter with 2 kids with black eyes, haven't you? And the psychic reportedly said that she couldn't do anything for her, but she advised her to speak to someone such as a priest. And she mentioned some people that Beth could perhaps contact. And she then more or less escorted Beth out and said that she would give her a refund for the session. Now, the implication from this, if we take it at face value, is that the psychic feared that she herself would be cursed if she kind of kept the interview with Beth going. Well, at least that's the implication as I took it. Beth did, in fact, speak out, someone, a sort of spiritual advisor of some form. I'm not quite sure what kind of spiritual advisor or helper. And I think was given some sort of blessing and did eventually, things started turning around for her. But again, we're left with this question, well, did this disturbing Beck encounter somehow trigger off this course of events? Or are we dealing with coincidence or perhaps an omen? This is a case that isn't from Weatherly. I came across this case just last month. I was watching an episode of an American series called Hometown something. It's obscured by the pictures of people on the screen, but it was called The Satanic Swamp, and it dealt with Freetown State Forest in southeastern Massachusetts. I'd heard of this place before. It's an area that has a bit of a sort of sinister reputation. Various things have gone on in this forest over the years. It's quite a large area of forest. There's been reputed satanic cult activity, or there's been some evidence of criminal activity. I think ghostly activity, and it's nearer or overlaps with an area known as the Bridgewater Triangle, which is a sort of purported window area. But anyway, regarding this particular incident, a Freetown resident, Freetown, by the way, is just, I think, a village, a sort of village, or if small town, in the area of the forest. A Freetown resident called John Brightman went out for a bike ride with a couple of friends, and he got ahead of his companions and stopped at a certain point in the forest to let them catch up. And he heard a sound like the breaking of a branch, and looked around and saw a small boy-like figure, 3.5 or 4 feet tall, with piercing black eyes. Brightman looked away momentarily, and the figure was gone when he looked back. So unlike the cases that I've mentioned from Weatherly's book, and I'll be returning to 1 or 2 of them in a moment, this was more like a kind of typical apparitional sighting, perhaps the only difference being the black eyes. Fleeting experience, no conversation between the Beck, the apparition. And another feature which was very apparition-like about this particular incident was that the witness could reportedly see through the figure. So it didn't appear to be a solid physical figure. No mention in the program of the witness having any kind of negative, bad luck, or whether he may have been a bit, upset by the experience, or maybe troubled by just the very fact that he had a ghostly experience. But there was no mention in the program, as I say, of any kind of serious bad luck. Now, in Weatherly's second book, the strange intruders, he includes a case of, well, it includes more than one case, I think, but it mentions black-eyed adults. Obviously, people, when they hear about black-eyed children, they might wish to know whether there are reports of black-eyed adults. This case is quite creepy, if it's to be believed. It concerns someone called Marcel, who was renting an apartment in a rather sort of maybe run-down part of New York City, or at least the apartment block was a bit run down. And across the corridor from him, or the hall from him, there was he had a strange neighbor, a man. And eventually this strange man was joined by a woman of Asian appearance. And the couple, both of them seemed a bit strange. And one day, near the door of their apartment, the woman was holding 2 packages of shopping, and she dropped one of them, and some cans fell out, and they were all of meat or fish. And Marcel tried to be helpful and bent down to pick up some of them for her, and the man angrily told him to leave it to the woman. And Marcel reportedly looked up, and he noticed that the woman's eyes were completely black. And then, as he was sort of crouching on the ground, and the woman was there as well, as she was trying to pick up some of her cans, he noticed that her eyes were also black, but they reverted to normal just within a few seconds. Now, these neighbors moved away just after Marcel's experience. He was quite disturbed by it, and he went, it was near Thanksgiving in late November, and he went to stay with friends, and I think he stayed a little bit longer than he originally planned, perhaps because he was a bit reluctant to return to the apartment. But when he got back, he found that these creepy neighbors had moved out. They'd probably, apparently, according to the landlord, they'd moved out rather suddenly. Interestingly, in terms of consequences, Marcel developed claustrophobia and an aversion to meat. His diet had hitherto been quite heavy in meat, and he didn't want to become a vegetarian, but he just couldn't tolerate meat after that, and so he became a vegetarian. I'm not sure whether he developed an aversion to fish, so I suppose, strictly speaking, he may not have been a vegetarian if he was eating fish, but it may be that he became averse to fish as well. I'm not sure. Now, one of the things about some of these accounts is that a suggestion has been made that in some ways the experience could have been engineered to bring about a change in the witness's life. And if you take that view, you could say that in some way the whole thing was aimed around kind of changing the course of Marcel's life. It seems a little bit far-fetched. But other people have also sort of gone on a more spiritual path, including Brian Bethel, perhaps after his, I think that's maybe true of Brian Bethel, I'm not sure, after their experience. I'm going to talk about Cannock Chase briefly. This is just a photo to show you what it's like in case you've never been there. It's an area, 26 square mile area of heath and woodland in Staffordshire. It's southeast of Stafford. It's a pleasant area. It's cut across by roads, tracks. I think there's a railway line running through it, and there are adjacent urban areas. It's not a terribly remote area. Over the years, it's attracted quite a lot of what one might call supernatural folklore, stories of UFOs, Bigfoot, strange animals of one sort or another, ghosts, apparitions, and so on. Now, I've looked into some of these reports, and some of them, I think are probably correct, probably true. I remember, for instance, a colleague of Bill Ayres had a ghostly experience there in her car. Just outside the Chase, actually, and I have no reason to think that wasn't a genuine experience. But it's been claimed by a man called Lee Brickley that there've been quite a lot of sightings in the area, not just on the heath and the woods, but in the adjacent urban areas as well, of a black-eyed girl, and he has written. I'll just actually go to these slides before I go. This is just another view of the part of the Chase. I'm not saying that these particular sites in the Chase I'm showing you are associated with black-eyed children, but that's just to give you an idea of the topography. Now, in this booklet, 47-page booklet I'm referring to, Lee Brickley cites 16 cases. 15 are written as first-person accounts, and one of them was ostensibly or reportedly written on behalf of the witness. The witness had difficulty apparently in sitting at a computer screen, and so it was done for her. They're first-hand accounts in effect. However, there's a very high degree of anonymity to the witnesses. which is, I find, problematic. You know, we're not told their names, we're not told their ages, and in the very large majority of these cases, we're not even told the gender of the witness. And I'll give you one or two examples in a minute. Despite this lack of information about the witnesses or the alleged witnesses themselves, there's a strange feature, is that very specific timings are given for the events. I mean, I think in one case it was 3:12 a.m. Now, if you're having a kind of ghostly experience in the middle of the night, seeing a black-eyed child, probably the last thing you'll be doing is checking your watch to find the precise time. You know, I would have expected people to sort of approximate if they're saying when they had an experience rather than give a precise time. This reminds me actually of a case back in the 60s. The Warminster area of Wiltshire acquired a reputation for UFO and other activity. And one of the people who promoted the stories about this was a local journalist, Arthur Shuttlewood. And he, in some of his accounts, I remember noticing when I was looking at them, he gave surprisingly precise times for when witnesses had experiences. And again, it occurred to me that it just sounded odd. You know, I mean, I would have thought that, you know, if I had an accident, for instance, driving to work or something like that, or going to a bank or whatever I was doing, I'd probably sort of say, well, it was about 10 to 9 or something like that. I probably wouldn't be able to tell you it was 11 minutes to 9. But anyway, that's by the way. So these reports, quite highly anonymous and also quite dramatic. Now this is an example. While walking home in the early hours of the morning, the witness saw what he took to be a little girl in the middle of the road. He asked whether she needed an assistant. She didn't reply. The witness got closer, called out again. The figure turned round, opened her eyes, which were then closed, but then he saw that they were black. The entity touched the witness's chest. The touch felt very cold and painful. The witness looked into the eyes and then found himself or herself lying on some grass, and it was 7 a.m. Now, hours had passed, in other words, and we've got this element of missing time, which isn't present in any of the cases I've mentioned regarding from Weatherly. The next one involved 3 people. Again, gender isn't specified. These, sorry, I'll move that slide down. Yeah. These friends in the early hours of the morning, I think this may be the 3:12 a.m. case I mentioned, but these friends like to hang out in, or allegedly like to hang out in a school field, not to do any damage, supposedly, but you know, just to get together. And they smoked some cannabis and had a bit of beer, and then they saw a figure which they approached, and it appeared to be a girl of about 10. She was bending down with her back to them. They called out to her, and the witness called out to her, and the girl slowly turned round, and she appeared to have black eyes. In shock, or she appeared to have no eyes. In shock, the three friends fell to the ground and screamed. As they started getting up, the girl lifted off the ground by, I think it was by about a foot, hovered there. And then after about 10 seconds, one of the people coughed, whereupon the girl shot up, presumably into the sky. Now, very dramatic stuff. As I say, there's also a bit of drug taking and drinking involved. I have to say that cannabis is, I suppose you could class it as a mild psychedelic drug. In other words, it does have effects on perception. It doesn't have effects on perception at normal doses that would particularly cause a vivid, very strange hallucination. So just the fact that cannabis had been smoked and maybe some beer had been drunk doesn't necessarily explain this vision or experience if it really happened. But it doesn't perhaps give a good impression of the credibility of the story. But I don't think we can be too categorical and say that just because cannabis had been smoked, that nothing, these people didn't experience what they thought they'd experienced, if the story, of course, is true. So we've got some evidential problems here, high degree of anonymization. This is a big problem actually in the whole paranormal field. I mean, I spoke about this at an ASSAP conference, you know, where people start using pseudonyms even with automatically. They don't, maybe without even telling their listeners or readers, which I think is bad practice. Imagine that you try to seek someone out because you're interested in the case and you didn't realize the name of a pseudonym. You could waste a lot of time trying to chase the person up, and then it turns out that name isn't real. Another problem with these Beck accounts, the ones I've looked at least, a lack of corroboration. And in the case of Brickley's booklet, there's reason to believe that at least 2 of the reports, there were 16, as I say, there's a reason to believe that at least 2 of them were written by the same person. The reason I say that is they both end with the same phrase, weird, eh? Now, there's in each case, the weird A contains 2 errors. The first one is a lack of a comma between weird and A, and the second error is a misspelling of the little word A. Instead of being EH, it's AY. Now, the likelihood that 2 separate informants out of 16 would have made that precisely the same wording at the end of their account and the same 2 errors, I think is, well, it's very unlikely. So my inference is that at least 2 of these 16 accounts were written by the same person. One possibility is that that Brickley obtained information from 16 people, or more than 16, since these cases were supposedly a selection, but he decided to write them up in his own style. In other words, although the wording, if you take it at face value, the accounts were written by each individual witness, they were actually, may have been written by Brickley in a style of his choosing, perhaps reflecting accurately the content that was conveyed to him, maybe by word of mouth, email, text, or other means. However, that doesn't guarantee, of course, that the informants were telling the absolute truth or were accurate in their testimony. So coming on to interpretation of these reports, I find it difficult really to be categorical because, as I say, I'm not sure about the evidence itself, really, how safe this evidence is. It may be that I'm unaware of much more sort of better corroborated stories, but I'd like to talk about briefly what I call the plurality fallacy. And this is the idea that if witnesses see 3 entities, it could be, say, 3 ghosts, 3 Becks, or 3 alien greys in a location, I think there's a tendency for people to assume that there must be 3 intelligences involved, whatever those intelligences are, whether those Becks or greys or whatever they are come from another dimension, come from outer space, or time travelers from a future. There's this sort of assumption that there's a one-for-one match between entity, how many entities are seen and how many spirits or ghosts or intelligences are involved. And I would suggest that some of these dramatic experiences may be orchestrations. They may be a bit like going to the theatre and seeing a drama. And it may be that there aren't 3 intelligences behind events like this. If there are 3 entities, it may be just 1 intelligence. And an analogy I would use is an art gallery. Imagine some people walking through the art gallery and they're looking at a picture, a painting by a famous artist depicting 2 men and a woman. And let's say the gallery guide addresses one of the viewers and says, "What do you see there?" And the person looks at the picture and says, "Well, I see 2 men and a woman." Now that answer, of course, is wrong, because what the onlooker is seeing is a painting, one thing created by one person, the artist. So I would suggest that we should guard against naive literalness and assuming that if people see three Becks, there are three intelligences involved. I should perhaps mention something I forgot, is that in Beck encounters, there are reports where people will maybe see two of them at the door, they'll momentarily look away, and when they look back, there are three. And you might say, well, how did the third one get there and all that sort of thing? But as I say, if we think of these experiences as possibly entailing not discrete entities, but the whole thing as a kind of drama, it doesn't matter how many entities there are, that there may only be one actual orchestrating intelligence. So just to look now at a few theories. One is that Becks are an urban legend spread by the internet and reinforced perhaps by hoaxing. Jenny Coleman, in an issue, I think it was the 2014 issue, an issue in 2014 of the magazine 14 Times, suggested something like this, that she argued that that you could see connections between the Beck story, or myth, as she would perhaps call it, and cultural things going on in the 1990s and subsequent years. There were television series such as Becky and the Vampire Slayer, the X-Files, and subsequently films and so on, where black-eyed characters appeared. And of course, the internet came into a big way, arose in the 1990s. So it could be seen as an urban legend. I don't know why people say urban legend, by the way. These legends, to me, there's nothing particularly urban about them, I think, but you know what I mean by that term. Against the idea that this all arose in sort of 1990s, David Weatherly claims that he's come across cases that predate both the internet and television. And in his book, The Black-Eyed Children, he discusses a case from around the 1950s concerning a man called Harold, who had a black-eyed encounter experience. And his story was passed down through family members, and whether he got to speak to some members of the family. So this experience went back to the 1950s. So the assertion that these things just go back to about 1996 is questionable. As I've said, these experiences tend to be disturbing to people, and naturally people have suggested that these entities are demonic. A related belief is that these entities are members of what in Islamic belief are called the jinn, if that's the right pronunciation, a kind of race of mischievous supernatural entities. Another view is that, or another suggestion or possibility is that Becks are alien hybrid, human hybrids. If you're familiar with UFO lore, you'll know that there are reports of people being abducted. Very often in these abduction reports, there are gray aliens are involved with slanting, almond-shaped black eyes. It's claimed that abductees are subjected to medical procedures, often revolving around reproduction, and people who take the alien abduction scenario seriously and think of it in a physical way, they have suggested that there could be hybridization going on. So it could be that these Becks are alien human hybrids. Another view, which I've already touched on, is that Becks are just another type of apparition or ghost. Certainly, one or two of the accounts I've mentioned, they were more ghost-like than suggestive of something with a kind of continuing physical or quasi-physical existence. Another view is that Becks could be thought forms, or tulpas. Imagine, for example, this is just a hypothetical suggestion, that imagine that our minds are linked together at a subconscious level, and we have a kind of common unconscious or subconscious mind. And imagine that a lot of people reading accounts of black-eyed children on the internet find them very exciting and thrilling and actually want to hear more such accounts. Now let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that this collective unconscious mind of ours has the ability to materialize entities on a transient basis to satisfy the collective wish of the unconscious. It could be that as a result of this group thought process, this collective wish, that some of these experiences arise as a result of that. Alternatively, but in the same vein, one could say, well, maybe these things are materializations, transient materializations, but they're not generated by a collective unconscious mind. They're actually generated by some sort of external intelligence. I would say that if there is such an intelligence, and I think there could be, it's not necessarily extraterrestrial or interdimensional or from our future. It may be something that's always been there in the shadows and with us, often passing unobserved. These different ideas aren't mutually exclusive. I've already hinted at this idea that black-eyed children could, in a sense, be messengers, or they could be a vehicle whose purpose is to steer people towards a more spiritual path. However, if that's the case, it doesn't seem likely to me that they would cause people to smash their car and make a child ill for 5 weeks and frighten the wits out of people.
Hello. If you don't know it, or it's in the front of the latest magazine or journal, and download Anomaly issue, I believe it's 49 or 50, I'm not sure which, to read Peter's excellent article on Cannock Chase. It was your article in Cannock Chase, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And, I mean, Lee, while you were away, Peter, we showed a video of an interview with Mr. Brickley, and also a very unconvincing woman who looks like the thing from The Ring hiding in the trees, another YouTube video, but I've recorded those as well as part of this. So
yes,
strange thing is that Kieran says he has memories of black-eyed children and adults gathered around the bed, and I've got to go out in a moment because it's my friend Huwake's birthday, but just before we go I'm going to share a very quick experience and you can tell me what you think of it. I certainly never thought of it as a black-eyed children experience, but it's a story of a love talisman, and it takes us back to the year 1992, and I was living in Cheltenham at Sydenham Road with Hugh Wake and Nikki Jordan, my then girlfriend, now Nikki Tolbert, and a number of other people who are very much still with us. And Dave Sivia, who's with us tonight, and you all know because he spoke last week, will possibly remember the discussion of the incident. In fact, might have possibly still been in forward, but anyway, somewhere in the late 80s, early 90s. And a friend of mine called Jez decided that he needed a girlfriend, but he was not having any luck by the traditional methods of going to the bar, getting drunk and disco dancing badly, which the rest of us employed. So he decided that he would ask me and my friends, who were clearly powerful occultists and knew a great deal about ghosts and the supernatural, if we would make him a love talisman. So naturally, we did. So we took a 2p piece, because copper is the metal of Venus. We painted it with emerald green sigils, which we took from the Rites of the Golden Dawn, from Israel Regarde's volume of it. And we performed a very simple spell that was meant to create a love talisman. Not because we were actually magicians or knew anything about such things, but just because we thought it was incredibly funny. And halfway along, poor Richard Lay got wax on his trousers, which looked positively obscene. We made a wand that we forgot to allow to dry, so we got paint all over our hands. And the light bulb exploded, which was really weird halfway through the spell. And shortly after the spell, Jez's car alarms went off, and when we went upstairs to his car, a bottle of beer that was resting inside the car exploded as well, probably because it had got too hot. Anyway, all these kind of strange things happened, and after that we were plagued by coincidences which lasted for the next 3 or 4 days. And in fact, coincidences or synchronicities happened all the time back then, but they just seemed to happen more and more and more, and we all had a feeling that we had probably done something incredibly stupid. Anyway, we gave Jez his 2p piece, and I can't actually remember, I think he ended off running off with one of my friend's wives, but that was later, that he ended up with Derek's wife. But, or possibly it wasn't, I can't remember the timeline. The only thing about the whole incident I remember involves me and Hugh Wake, and because we're far from anonymous, I will quite happily share our names and tell you what happened. We went over to Gloucester probably to visit a shop there and buy something that we couldn't get in Cheltenham. I can't remember why we were in Gloucester. And we came back on the train. And as we came back on the train, we had a weird feeling that we'd done the spell earlier that day and the things had exploded and it had all been a bit strange. And as we came back on the train, having had a fairly ordinary time in Gloucester, it was a little local Central's train with only 2 carriages. And the first one we got into had 2 men dressed in black who were both completely bald. And I don't mean they had shaved heads. I mean they were bald. But they were wearing black suits despite the fact we were in the middle of a heat wave. And they stood next to each other and they kept looking at us. And we didn't say anything, but as we it's only an 8-minute journey, but within 2 minutes they had kind of walked slowly down and stood and kept staring at me and H. So as you do, we got up, looked at these 2 fellows who were quite big and who didn't speak, and who made a joke about the Gospel According to the Men in Black, the Stranglers album, and I said we'll tell Sivia when we see him. And we ran off down the train. So we went down the train and we got into the other carriage. And that was the really freaky bit, because at the time I was quite clearly infatuated with a pair of blonde twins, but they were of my own age. But at this point, 2 little girls who were apparently twins appeared. Now, I cannot tell you, I cannot remember at all if they had black eyes or pink eyes or green eyes, or, there was nothing unusual about their eye coloration that I can remember. But what I clearly remember was that they started off sitting at the far end. They stood up and they walked down and they stood and looked at me and Hugh and looked like they were about to speak but didn't. And I said, "Do you want something?" And they just looked at us. But we were trying not to look at their faces, and I cannot remember why. We didn't want to look at them, not directly. So we stood up and we moved down the train to the final carriage by the driver's compartment. And at that point, 8 minutes into the journey, we pull into Cheltenham and we get off the train. And these 2 little girls, who were probably about 10 to 12 years old, get off the train and not unreasonably follow us out of the station. So we head off down the road. And as we're heading down the road, we notice that they're walking a bit faster behind us. So you've got 2 lads in their 20s who are absolutely bricking it because they're being followed by 2 sweet little girls aged about 10. And by this time, we had both come to the conclusion that the 2 black, bald guys in black and the 2 girls who were following us were exactly the same thing. Now, I feel no shame whatsoever in sharing weird experiences because I've had quite a few. And I'm not saying it's paranormal, but because of the context, we were completely convinced that these creatures were following us, and it was some kind of entity. I think we used words like tulpa or egregore because we were heavily interested. I was heavily interested in the occult by this point. And as we fled, we spoke to Dave Curtin about it. DC's probably here tonight. DC, are you here? And we would have told Dave Sivia about it. Unless DC had gone off for his short-lived period of time in the MA doing his antiques auctioneering. But I think I told DC about it at the time. And I think I told Dave Sivia about it at the time. Hi, Dave. You there? Can you unmute? Oh, he's disappeared. No, he hasn't. DC, can you hear me? Can you speak, Dave? Oh, his microphone might not be working. But anyway... The point is that, like all of my weird stories, there's a whole load of people who were involved at the time who will remember what happened. And Hugh, who I was with that day, is going off in a second. We're going off to enjoy his birthday. So, sorry to bore you with my dull story. It ends really quite uninterestingly because we ran like hell. Jez came along, picked us up in his car and gave us a lift. And we eventually decided that the only thing we could do was to get rid of this love talisman because so many weird things were happening around us. So we had a midnight prayer and burial exorcism service and buried it under what is now the Park Bar at the University of Gloucestershire, which they were building at the time. So, yeah, really strange experience. Anyway, enough of my embarrassing stories about the past. Dave Sivia, John Keel believed that all strange encounters were caused by a deranged computer at the end of time. Mr. Sivia, are you there?
I'm here, CJ.
Can you remember Can you remember us telling you about the little girls on the train and the men in black?
I'm afraid I can't. I can remember many other weird stories from you at the time, CJ, but sadly not that one.
Sadly, that was
I must
possible.
have been away or something. Is something,
It might be. It might have happened in your third year when you were in Bristol and we were still at the uni. But yeah,
It could. You
it
could do.
involved
Yeah.
Jez Reichman, which suggests it was late anyway, because I think we were living with him at when we moved up to Leckhampton, and I was at Sherborne Street. Anyway, yeah, you were saying about John Keel's beliefs. What do you think about the Men in Black? Sorry, the black-eyed children. Are they linked to the Slender Man? Are they linked to the Men in Black?
Only in the sense of the manifestations of demonic reality. I mean, Keel did have some peculiar views. I mean, he talks about. I mean, it's in Disneyland of the Gods where he talks about that, and he describes it like a broken record in the sky or something, just going on and on and on, and yeah,
He uses the term ultra-terrestrials, doesn't he? This
he
seems
does.
Is this close to what Pierre's talking about? Pierre, would you like to just go through your personal view? Are you there? Don't know if Pierre can hear us.
Hi, Chris. Yeah, I can, mate. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, not too bad. You all right?
Yeah, good, thanks. Yeah, so, I mean, I've got no, this is just something that I've been thinking about for a little while since I've heard about it. And it's really interesting phenomena. And so, yeah, just a theory that I've just been batting around in my mind is obviously, for me, it feels like it's something trying to emulate the human form in some way. And I would suggest that the eyes, if you're going to try and replicate something, the eyes would always be the most difficult part to do. So for me, it just almost feels like it's some kind of artificial intelligence or some kind of replication with a controller there, and it's looking to try and get into to manipulate people or to do something. And so, yeah, in terms of what that is, I mean, it could be military. You could imagine if they could actually replicate. Think about what they knew about in the 60s and the 70s and what we know about now. I should imagine there'd be a lot of UFO sightings that were actually drones being tested and things like that at different lights. So you imagine if they're kind of testing something out that they could put into, I don't know, an area looking like the human form, but it's actually doing something else for them. It would just make me wonder whether this is something connected to that, or even if technology gets to the stage where it's sustainable and can get out of our reach. It could be a virus, or it could even be a toy from the future with someone having a right laugh about how we can scare people back in the 2021s with the little kids turning up and knocking on the windows. So, yeah, just, I don't know. It's just something that really interests me, and my mind just runs away with the possibilities, I guess.
I think those are all very good possibilities. They're all worth exploring, aren't they? And if we can actually find a single case where we actually know. Talking of which, yeah, Mr. Shearsmith's League of Gentlemen, where is he tonight? Has he not turned up? No. No, Reese. Oh, probably because I sent him the message 2 days before. This was before I researched LSD, Phil. What I will say is that the Men in Black legends, the low energy, the depletion, the coming in pairs or three of them, they all seem very, very common, wouldn't you say, Peter? Mr. McCue?
Yeah.
So,
There's certainly commonalities between the, black-eyed children and Men in Black. One of the things I didn't mention, I think it's said about black-eyed children, is their clothing sometimes seems a little ill-fitting, maybe if it's hand-me-downs and so on. And Men in Black, I think, are sometimes described as being, although they've got sort of maybe formal type clothes, maybe ill-fitting. Also, the language is sort of rather gauche. I don't know that that's actually true of the reported children, black-eyed children. I think they're sort of polite. I don't know that they come across as sort of gauche, but certainly there seem to be some similarities between the two kinds of phenomena. There's also a possible link with folklore in the sense that in vampire legends, it's said that vampires need to be invited in. And some people would say that if there's a kind of a crossover between or a parallel between folklore and paranormal reports, this shows that the paranormal reports are based on that folklore and a sort of nothing genuinely paranormal going on. But I think it could be a sort of reciprocal connection there, that sometimes maybe paranormal activity will will draw on existing folklore motifs in order to put on performances. You know, I tend to think of it as a very theatrical business in a way, the paranormal.
Yeah, I think theatrical is the word for it, isn't it? It's intervening in people's lives in a dramatic,
Yes.
performative manner. Paula asks, is there any corroborating evidence for sightings of Becks, such as security footage or police reports?
From my not, I nearly said experience, which is the wrong word. From my reading and on this subject, I'm not aware of any strong corroborating evidence. That's not to say there isn't any. As I say, it may well be that if you spoke to someone like David Weatherly, you'd find that actually, although he hasn't explicitly said it in his book, some of these first-hand case reports were to a degree corroborated. Maybe he did speak to other family members, but he just hasn't sort of mentioned that. But I think that's an issue that needs to be addressed, because I think for these reports to be taken seriously, you know, or other reports to be taken seriously, I think we need some corroboration. I mean, we've got plenty of it with other types of paranormal events, such as poltergeist experiences and phenomena. You know, sometimes you can get corroboration from the police and so on. But so it would be nice to know if there is corroborating evidence in this case.
I wonder if there's anyone's ever tried to exorcise them as well. Dave Siv says the statues of the gods and kings from ancient Sumer have large eyes, and now we're heading desperately towards Eric von Daniken, aren't we? I don't know if they are physical entities or if they are psychological projections, and if they're hallucinatory, then maybe, as Pierce says, just as a computer might find it hard to accurately do eye movement. I mean, I recently was busy reanimating H.P. Lovecraft by using modern software to take a photo of him and make it look as if he was moving and his eyes were moving and his expression changes. And that worked quite well. But the eyes are the hard bit to do, I think. And maybe if Myers argued that all of these things were telepathic projections, we pick up information encoded in the environment and then render it using the same mechanics we do when we're dreaming, so the brain hallucinates and projects it on an outside world. Maybe. Oh, Piers says there's a really interesting account on Jim Harold's Campfire podcast where a state trooper pulled one over. Can you post the link, Pierre, if possible?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll go back into it. I mean, it's something I've been listening to that, and you know, there's all kinds of accounts on there, but this one, I mean, it's a state trooper. That the guy was in his 20s, and he says that he's 6'6". He's got a sidearm as well, and he pulled over this car. And as soon as he pulled it over, he did things differently. He didn't report in his location or anything like that, which is bread and butter. And he had a really bad feeling about it. And yeah, it was really interesting. I mean, I don't want to spoil the account, but he got up to the car, and the person that was there didn't say a word, just turned around and looked at him. And it had the black eyes. There was a horrible stench as well, and yeah, it also had the massive smile as well, which sometimes you hear about. And the trooper just literally got in his car, drove away, and didn't even file the report. So yeah, really interesting account, and I'll have a look back and see if I can find the link. I'll post it.
I just realised we missed an opportunity tonight, Pierre, because when we, as you were so keen to come along and listen to this, I should have got you to get some whole eye contact lenses, because they have existed since around about the mid-90s, and basically they can make your pupils completely black or completely red or whatever colour you want. They used them originally in Hollywood, but they are cosmetically available and quite cheap. Goths, when I was young at Slimelight, used to wear them sometimes. I understand they're also terribly bad for your eyes, but we could have had Pierre appear with black eyes, which would have been amazing. Pierre, by the way, is my nephew, so hello, Pierre. Nice to meet you.
Hello.
Nice to see you. I know you, obviously, but yeah.
David Weatherly makes the point that back in I think it was the 1990s, these black contact lenses were quite expensive. So it's perhaps unlikely that adolescents would go to the bother and expense of getting them just for a one-off prank. That may not be the case now, of course.
Yeah, £50, Matthew Arnold says now. So, yeah, I don't think that even now children would be able to get them, because children's eyes are being formed, and I mean, children can wear contact lenses, but whole eye ones, I think they're incredibly bad for you. But yeah, I don't know. Like all of these things, I really don't know what the truth is.
An interesting, sorry to interrupt, but I was going to say an interesting parallel again with these links between different aspects of the paranormal is the bad smell that sometimes occurs after a beck has appeared and can persist from there are reports in Bigfoot lore of these entities or creatures exuding a really nauseating smell. However, in Bigfoot cases, it seems to me that the smell could possibly be interpreted as a way of driving someone away and protecting territory, not necessarily as a sort of anything malignant in its own right.
Right. Well, that is interesting actually, though, because it's a separate. I mean, the sight hallucination is the primary modality. Then you've got the auditory hallucination of the voices when they talk to you. Has anyone actually touched one?
A beck, or
yeah, a beck.
Yes, well, in one of the cases I cited,
Right.
well, more than one of the cases, I think two, there was physical contact, but it wasn't instigated by the human. It was, or the person, the witness. It was allegedly instigated by the entity.